Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome, people, to Inside Scoop. My name is Deborah Woolen, and I will be your host for this evening. More and more we hear on the news of lives being taken by law enforcement officers. We ask ourselves, did they make the right decision? Who will hold them responsible? Are they going to be accountable? Well, tonight we are going to discuss navigating our criminal justice system in the face of police misconduct. Our first guest is Chelsea Crawford of Brown, Goldstein, and Levy. Chelsea has worked on some of the largest wrongful conviction and police misconduct cases in the state of Maryland. She's obtained $6.5 million settlement on behalf of the family of Eric Sopp. She's helped obtain nearly $8 million in settlement for two men who were wrongfully convicted and imprisoned. And she has helped obtain $9 million in settlement on behalf of a man who was wrongfully convicted and imprisoned after 24 years after Baltimore detectives concealed evidence that could have cleared him from guilt. Chelsea, welcome.
Thank you for having me,
Sure.
Deborah.
Thank you so much for coming. So, gosh, in the news, we have heard of Yarena Rios Gonzalez, who was the young lady who Jordan Stank of Fort Lipton and Detective Pablo Vasquez allegedly left her on the train tracks in a police car. Also, you have recently there are cases that are being thrown out as we speak because of the discovery of egregiously dishonest law enforcement officers and detectives. So oftentimes, as I mentioned, that kind of leaves us wondering, these officers or these people who have sworn to protect and service, who keeps them accountable? And if there is accountability, what is that measure? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, law enforcement accountability and police accountability generally, I think there are two perspectives you can view. There's the kind of internal perspective from law enforcement agencies and things that they can do within their own agencies to hold their fellow officers accountable. You've got internal affairs departments, you've got policy changes within departments and supervisors who need to be taking closer watch of their subordinates, things that the agencies themselves can do to hold each other accountable. I don't have much experience in that. But then there's also things that the private citizens can do to hold law enforcement agencies accountable. So for police departments in particular, there are always citizen complaints. So if you're a citizen, a private citizen, and you feel like you've been the victim of police misconduct, you can always go to your local police department and try and file a citizen complaint or a complaint of misconduct within the department. And the department itself has the obligation to investigate and to, figure out exactly what happened and to discipline that officer if there was indeed misconduct. So that's one area. There's also, of course, private lawsuits, and that's where sort of I come in, the work that I do. You can hire an attorney to file a lawsuit on your behalf against the officer or officers, and even the police department. We can talk about that. As a way to, vindicate your rights. If you feel like you've been the victim of excessive force, if you feel like you've been wrongfully convicted and incarcerated as a result of officer misconduct, you can file a lawsuit. But there are pros and cons to that.
Sure.
Litigation itself is very tedious. It takes many, many years. And depending on what kind of lawsuit you're filing, you may not always be successful in the end. And so those are some of the considerations that you should be thinking about if you are going to go the direction of filing a lawsuit to hold a law enforcement agency or police officer accountable for what you perceive is misconduct.
I'm glad you brought those options up, and we are going to get into that. But your background is so varied and so diverse. How did you get to this place where this is your main area of focus?
Well, so I kind of fell into this work, actually. So as you mentioned, I am a partner at the law firm of Brown, Goldstein, and Levy, and it's headquartered in Baltimore. And we started with that one case that you were describing earlier. We represented a man by the name of James Owens, and he had served 21 years in prison, in Maryland prison, wrongfully for a crime he never committed. And we represented him in a lawsuit against several Baltimore Police Department officers and the department itself. And ultimately that case settled for $9 million. And it took years. We filed that lawsuit. It was filed back in, I want to say it was 2015, and it took many, many years for that case to resolve. Wow. And so that's another example of litigation as a means to vindicate your rights, but you've got to be very patient. And these cases are oftentimes, they go up and down on appeal. And so in the case of Mr. Owens, his case was appealed to the Fourth Circuit and went back down to the district court level where it was further litigation, which ultimately resulted in it settling. But it took many, many years. And when you are going through very tedious litigation like that, and you're a plaintiff alleging, let's say, that you've been the victim of excessive force, there's a lot of scrutiny on plaintiffs. There's a lot of second guessing. Is the incident that you're complaining about, did it actually go down the way that you're describing it? And so through JJ's case, his name is James Owens, but he went by JJ, after his case, we started getting more and more calls about excessive force and more calls about wrongful convictions. And that work really began to grow. We started taking more of those cases, investigating more of those cases, and taking on the ones that really had some merit. And so at this point, I've kind of lost count of how many we've actually done, but quite a bit, and mostly all involving Baltimore Police Department officers or Baltimore County officers. So a pretty local practice and local to Maryland, not so much national at this point.
Sure. You brought up something interesting. You talked about, from a community perspective, well, there's the civil case, and then also what a community can do, or practices or policies that are in place, or tools for citizens. What is that? What creates that gulf? If there are policies in place within a department, if there are, what you're supposed to do, policies and standards of procedure that you're supposed to follow as an officer to make sure you are acting lawfully. And then there are oversight bodies within the community. If we have these things in place, what happens between, having these systems in place that are supposed to be checks and balances? What happens between that and then, police departments getting to a place where they just have these egregious, cultures of abuse? What creates that gulf?
Well, I don't think there's any single perfect tool that's going to get you, you implement this tool and suddenly you've got a police department that's following all rules and everyone's happy with the way that they're policing. So I think there's one explanation potentially is that there is a gulf between what officers are trained to do and what they know to do and what they actually do in practice in the field. And so there's the formal training they receive in police academy that says this is how you restrain someone, this is how you effectuate a traffic stop. And then there's the on-the-job training, informal training that happens that really is the product of police culture, how a department actually operates, how things are done over years, over decades. And I think that's where you see that divergence between, right and wrong, and where you get these instances where citizens are becoming victims of excessive force or some kind of misconduct. It's not going to be in a manual that says, Officer so-and-so, you are allowed to rob a citizen of any money that you recover when you are, making an arrest. That's going to be a practice or an example of a bad practice that an officer does in the field and that another officer turns a blind eye to, and it becomes, before you know it, a practice of this particular unit. And so I don't think you're going to find examples of this kind of bad conduct in any kind of officer manual. You're more likely to see it on the job in the day-to-day way that officers are policing. And so the challenge is really, how do you change the culture? How do you make sure that what you're training is actually implemented? And you could try and do that through private lawsuits, where you file a lawsuit against an officer for misconduct and expose that kind of behavior and hope that by turning some attention to it, it will incentivize the department and the city, who's overseeing oftentimes the departments, to make sure that that conduct never happens again. And we've seen some examples of that in Baltimore with their police department.
If there is this knowledge, there's this awareness that there's this pervasive kind of bad culture that happens and turns essentially these good apples into bad apples. From your perspective and your opinion, does the court take that into consideration in these cases? And how does that kind of impact a court's tendency to defer to law enforcement?
I think it depends on what kind of lawsuit you're bringing. You can bring a lawsuit for excessive force. You can bring a lawsuit for, a wrongful conviction case. There's all kinds of ways that you can bring your particular encounter with police if you believe you've been the victim of misconduct to the courts. One major federal civil rights statute that you can use as a vehicle to vindicate your rights is 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, informally known as Section 1983. And that is a federal statute that allows you, a private citizen, to file a lawsuit against a state actor, a state government employee, or anyone acting under color of law, so with the full authority of the state behind it. And if you feel like that state actor has deprived you of your constitutional rights, you can file a lawsuit to vindicate those constitutional rights. So it's a vehicle to get you into court and to have a judge kind of look at your case. So if you're talking about an excessive force case and you're using a 1983 as a way to get your case into court, courts are going to be looking at the totality of the circumstances. If you're claiming that your Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures was violated because an officer arrested you and did it, aggressively or injured you as a result of that encounter, and you file a lawsuit, the court is going to say, what did that officer act reasonably under the circumstances? Would a reasonable officer have done the same thing that officer did under the circumstances? And I think in those situations, you're more likely to see courts, defer or be less willing to second guess an officer's actions because they're making these split-second decisions on the job.
Oh my goodness, such a great discussion. Please make sure you come back and stay tuned for the next segment as we speak with attorney Chelsea Crawford and discussing how do we navigate our criminal legal system in the face of police misconduct. Please come and see us again.
So, I just moved in with this family, and it's embarrassing. The little one, he likes to go outside and crawl around in the giant litter box. I don't know what he's doing. I mean, I was born and I knew how to use the litter box. Look at that. That's disgusting. Oh, poop already. You're making me nervous. Oh, okay, I can't look at this anymore. I really hope he grows out of this, for his sake.
So how was work?
It was 1,300 hours. My math class from 302 was in the trenches. Davy Roth had it the worst. Fractions were coming at him left and right. He just didn't get the damn things. 2 days ago, I tried to teach him what 1/4 of 1/2 was using different sizes of blocks. Yesterday, I tried again by dividing up pizza. Both missions failed.
Oh, no.
But today, I was ready. I created a combat math game where the only way to beat the enemy is to out-fraction them. Davy conquered every last denominator. My game was so successful, the principal is deploying it to math squadrons all over the school.
Anywho, how was your day?
Oh, today my boss treated the office to salad wraps.
Salad wraps.
I know.
150 over 90.
180 over 111.
160 over 110. I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure looks like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from invisible or silent. If you've come off your treatment plan, get back on it, or talk with your doctor to create an exercise, diet, and medication plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
If I would have followed a treatment plan, I would not be in this situation.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Thank you so much for joining us. As we continue our conversation with Attorney Chelsea Crawford of Brown, Goldstein, and Levy, we are discussing navigating our current political legal system in the face of police misconduct. And kind of segueing into the next topic, which connects to our previous point, qualified immunity.
Yes.
We were talking about if someone feels that their rights have been violated, and you mentioned U.S. Code 42. Was it 1983?
42 U.S.C. Section 1983. You can just call it Section 1983.
Section 1983. Talk a bit more about that. But then also, we've been hearing a lot on the news, and we hear it often, qualified immunity. What does that mean? And as a citizen, how does that impact me if I do feel like I've been the victim of police misconduct?
Well, qualified immunity can be a major hurdle to any plaintiff filing a lawsuit against an officer for excessive force, for example. So qualified immunity is a judicially created doctrine that essentially says not only as a plaintiff do you have to prove that the officer's conduct was unlawful, but that the unlawfulness of that conduct was clearly established before your incident. And so it's difficult for plaintiffs to overcome this doctrine of qualified immunity, which is a defense that the officer will raise, because it really requires the plaintiff to prove that the exact set of facts in which you believe misconduct occurred has occurred prior to your case, and that a court has determined that that conduct was unlawful previously. So it's sort of a way that courts require plaintiffs to prove that the officer was on notice that that behavior was unlawful. And so the language the court uses is that that conduct must be clearly established. The unlawfulness of that conduct must be clearly established. And so you can imagine it's very difficult to prove that your exact set of facts happened previously and that a court has determined that previously that conduct was unlawful. And so it is a real barrier for plaintiffs filing civil lawsuits because defendants oftentimes win on qualified immunity, a basis of qualified immunity, and they get to go scot-free. And also the way that this law has developed is that it allows courts to kind of do that two-prong assessment, whether the conduct was unlawful and whether that unlawfulness was clearly established. They can do that assessment in any order. So they don't even need to reach the question of whether it was unlawful. They can just resolve the case on whether that conduct was clearly established. And so if a court deems that that exact set of facts has not occurred previously, then it's not clearly established and the defendant can raise this defense successfully. So it is a real problem for plaintiffs looking to hold officers accountable for excessive force.
So we would be remiss to talk about qualified immunity and talk about police misconduct if we did not talk about the impact on the Black community, specifically as it relates to qualified immunity and these behaviors that have to, like a pattern that has to be established. Does the court take race into consideration? Like what should we expect if I wear brown skin to go into the courtroom and just assume that the court is going to defer to an officer? How do we unwrap that?
Well, so I don't think there's a way to extract race from any encounters between Black citizens and law enforcement. If the plaintiff, if the citizen feels like there's misconduct and it was on the basis of race, I don't think you can ignore that fact, is what I'm trying to say. But I don't think it's the role of courts to call that out for you. If you're a plaintiff and you're filing a lawsuit, it's your case. And so when you are writing your complaint, which is the doctrine that really sets off the entire litigation, it's up to you to make that argument or to make that allegation that you believe that race played a part. And if you do believe it played a part, make the allegation. You can include a claim even specific to kind of the particular experience that you had. So let's say you were arrested and you feel like the officer called you a racial slur or did something that was egregious on the basis of your race. There are certain claims you can bring under state law where you can maybe make an allegation specific to race. So there's always the state law tort of intentional infliction of emotional distress, where there was some conduct that was so egregious, so traumatizing, it's caused you significant emotional distress, I would insert some language about race and some allegations about race and the way that it affected me in a claim like that, and I would bring that in a lawsuit. But it is most definitely, I think, the burden of plaintiffs and their lawyers to make those allegations in the case and to, you know, make it in your arguments before the court. It's not really the obligation of the court to say, I think this was a race-based encounter. That's not what a judge is going to do. It's up to the lawyer to make those arguments.
Cell phone footage. Speaking of police misconduct, and where race is a factor, we're all aware of what happened with George Floyd. So the young lady who recorded Mr. Floyd's death, she was about 5 feet away. In Florida, the Florida House, there's a representative there who penned legislation that would essentially make it illegal for a bystander to be within 30 feet of a law enforcement officer, standing. So if an officer sees you within 30 feet and he or she tells you to leave and you do not, you're essentially obstructing justice. Considering the fact that the young lady that recorded George Floyd was 5 feet away, and this legislation would make it illegal to be within 30 feet, how would that impact the use of cell phone footage in holding law enforcement accountable? Because if we did not have that cell phone footage, we don't know what would have happened or how Mr. Floyd would have been projected, in court.
Oh, sure. I mean, there's no doubt that cell phone footage and the proliferation of cell phone cameras has been a huge asset for plaintiffs wanting to file civil lawsuits against law enforcement officers when they have an encounter where there's misconduct or where there's excessive force. And in addition to cell phone cameras, though, you also have officer-worn body camera footage. And we're seeing police departments all across the country now roll out body cameras. And those cameras are right on the chest. So it's another way that you can have kind of an objective piece of video to counter an officer's narrative of events. And I think we cannot say enough how critical camera footage is when you are filing a case of excessive force, because oftentimes an officer will, say, I perceived a threat. I thought that this individual was armed, and so that's why I fired that lethal shot. And sometimes that body camera footage tells a much different story and can be invaluable for a plaintiff to contest a narrative where previously there was just your word versus the officer's word. And so often in those situations, the officer's perception of the threat and of the environment is going to be the one that's viewed to be more credible. But when you've got body camera footage or cell phone footage, that really is going to tell the real story about what happened. So I would hope that we're not going to see laws passed around the country where there's, prohibiting individuals from recording encounters between police and everyday citizens. I'd have some real questions about whether that law is constitutional in light of the First Amendment. But I think by and large, we're seeing that people are able to record an officer's encounter, and that's perfectly fine. That's not an offense for which they can be arrested if they're not interfering in the officer's arrest or whatever the officer is doing. You absolutely can record encounters, and if you think that there's an encounter that's going the wrong way, I encourage people to record those situations as a way to hold an officer accountable.
Absolutely. With our, 3 minutes left, if someone believes that they have been the victim of police misconduct, what should they do?
Well, there are a few things. You can go the route that I mentioned earlier, which is filing a citizen's complaint against that particular officer through the police department. I think I'd always encourage that. I mean, part of what you want to do is make a record of what happened and to kind of memorialize what happened. So I would absolutely get the officer's badge number and pursue a citizen complaint through the police department's own internal procedures. And they often have internal affairs divisions and have their own process to investigate complaints of misconduct. I'd also encourage you to reach out to a lawyer. Reach out to a law firm or an attorney who handles plaintiffs' civil rights lawsuits and have someone investigate your case, have someone look into the merits of your case. Try and get the body camera footage. If you know that that officer was wearing a camera and you have it, get the request the footage. If you've seen witnesses in the area recording the encounter, get the footage from them as well. Do as much as you can to gather the record, because you want to memorialize exactly what happened and the steps that you took to vindicate your own rights.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
Gosh,
you.
with our 2 minutes left, I think I have a couple more questions, if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
please.
Okay, sure. Going back to what you mentioned about body cam footage, if an officer covers his camera, or if he or she doesn't turn it on, in your experience, are the standards or the standards of behavior, are they succinct enough to hold an officer or a detective accountable for that type of behavior?
Well, so I don't think you would file a lawsuit if, an officer covered a camera or didn't turn the camera on when you thought the encounter should have been recorded. I don't see how you would know, but I think for that kind of misconduct, the best thing to do is to get the police officer's badge number and to contact the police department and say, hey, this thing happened. Or if you can request the body camera footage and you don't have it because it wasn't recorded, maybe you can then raise that concern about why it wasn't recorded with the police department itself. My sense is, and I don't know this to be true, but my sense is there are policies within the department that require officers to turn on their cameras as soon as they, are responding to a call, or as soon as they are, engaged in an encounter, and to not obstruct or turn the cameras off. My guess is that there are those policies and that they're aware of them, and that if they are not following them, the best way to do it is to go through the department and to try and raise the issue directly with the Internal Affairs Division if the department has one. Absolutely.
One more question: citizens advisory boards, as an oversight body, do you think they're effective?
I think it remains to be seen how effective they can be. I think we're seeing many more of them across different counties in Maryland for sure. And that, that is one tool in a vast toolkit to hold officers accountable, and, we'll continue to kind of watch and see the improvements that they make.
Yes. Thank you so much, Attorney Crawford. We really enjoyed having you this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Please make sure you come back as we interview Attorney Duane Blackman as we continue to discuss navigating our criminal legal system in the face of misconduct. Please stay tuned to the next segment.
I surrender.
All right, pal. Get ready for the day, buddy.
Hey, Dad. Hey, Dad. Do we have a gun?
What's that?
Do we have a gun?
Maybe you can make retirement happen. After all, you made this vacation happen.
Double points with every purchase?
Cleverly merging promotions.
Love it.
Cross-referencing travel sites. And booking all your flights with those...
Vouchers. I got us bumped.
They were like, oh. But now they're like... Aloha. You aced this vacation. Now get the tips you need to get on track at aceyourretirement.org.
I tried Oxy at a couple of parties. I thought I had it under control. I didn't know it'd be this addictive. I didn't know how far I'd go to get more.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth.
What to expect when you're expecting.
Like here.
A teenager.
Today, I'm going to show you how to teen-proof your home. First step, hide the car keys. Preferably somewhere they would never look. Challenges will come up. Be ready for them. Hi, honey.
Ready for the... Mom, you don't use mannequins in the mannequin challenge.
You don't have to know it all to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will love you just the same.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Thank you so much for joining us again. So now we have attorney Duane Blackman joining us of Caleb and Duane. So attorney Blackman previously served as the deputy chief of trials for the Borough of Brooklyn's Tort Division of the City of New York. He also created and led a trial team for the city's Special State Law Enforcement Defense Unit, which is a specialized unit created specifically to litigate police misconduct cases. Duane also served as a senior trial attorney in the equity section of the DC office of the Attorney General, where he defended the district and its executive level agencies, officials, and employees. Duane, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. So you've kind of been on both sides. You have defended law enforcement agencies as well as plaintiffs against law enforcement. Talk about that a bit. Talk about those two different perspectives.
I think in either case, right, let's take, for example, the case of excessive force, if we're talking about police misconduct cases. In either side, right, whether I'm defending police officers or bringing claims on behalf of plaintiffs, we're looking at the same basic question, right? Whether or not, given a particular circumstance, was the officer's actions reasonable, right? So the question is the same, the perspective is however different. So if I'm a government attorney, that I was at the time, I'm looking at, well, how can we defend those actions? Are these actions, do they meet the legal standard for liability, or can we defend them? If they don't meet legal standards, then, you know, we have to settle the case. If they do, then we're defending the case. As a plaintiff, you're looking at things differently. You're looking at the officer's actions, and you're saying, well, is there a claim here? So there's that. That said, in either defending cases and either bringing cases, the conversations are much different, right? So if you're defending the government, you're having conversations with police officers. You're having conversations with government officials, right? So if I'm having a conversation with a police officer, he or she is telling me, well, why he or she did what they did in a given moment, faced with a particular crime, faced with having to make a particular arrest. When I'm talking to a plaintiff, right, a victim of police brutality, a victim of an unlawful arrest, the discussion is much different. So I'm having discussions about the trauma that a person faced because of that police misconduct. I'm having conversations about, you know, why did this officer do what he or she did, given that I was only doing X, Y, Z. So the conversations are much different.
Gotcha. So going back to when you mentioned that you represented the government, just from your perspective, at what point is an officer considered a liability? Is it one time? Is it 2 times? Does it depend on the level of grievability of an instance?
I think you look at a given case, and you're looking at a particular officer's given conduct. And if that conduct does not meet whatever the particular legal standard is, if we go back to, let's say, excessive force. So you're looking at the officer's action. You're looking at the officer's actions given a particular circumstance and whether or not that officer's actions within that circumstance was reasonable, right? Was it okay? If it wasn't, then that officer, you know, I don't know, I don't want to call him a liability,
sure,
but this is not a case that you're going to defend, right? It's not, because he hasn't conducted himself to comport with whatever the particular legal standard is. So yeah, those types of cases you shouldn't be defending, or we're going to try and settle those particular cases.
What is it that, so we look at television, right? We look at Scandal, we look at, what is it? SVU, Special Victims Unit, was it Law and Order? What is it that, from a civilian's perspective, what are some assumptions that you've seen that people make that aren't necessarily realistic when it comes to our expectation for police conduct?
So I've heard comments like, for instance, in the excessive force context, right? if, for instance, there's a situation in which a police officer has to bring a person into custody and the individual is shot dead, right? So I've heard things like, well, why didn't the officer shoot the person in the foot or shoot the person in the finger? And those things, while portrayed on TV as something easy to do and it happens often, I don't think that's the reality of things. I think oftentimes in situations that are high pressured, people can't do those things. That's why these things are TV shows, right? I think given the reality of situations, officer actions are much different in certain circumstances. So I think sometimes the expectation is that people are going to see in real life what they see on TV, and that's not correct. And also to note is that the legal standard isn't that, right? The legal standard isn't, well, let's do what you see on TV, or let's do the most perfect thing that a police officer could have done in that particular circumstance. It's not that. It is, as I've been mentioning, well, what is reasonable given the circumstances? Meaning a jury, a bunch of people sitting down looking at this situation, would they believe that the actions of a particular officer in the moment was reasonable?
So that brings me to the next question, or another question, civil cases, right? Like that is a tool that we have if we believe that we have been the victim of police misconduct. But many of us wonder, does the system work? Especially as it relates to marginalized communities. There is over-policing, and there is this perception that depending on where the community where excessive force has taken place, we kind of assume that there's this likelihood that there won't be a conviction, that there is no accountability. So, since you've been on both sides, from a policy perspective or even from a litigation perspective, does the system work? Or are there places for improvement?
I mean, like anything else, right? Litigation is a tool. It's not a cure-all. It's not going to fix everything. It's a tool. I've seen it work, and I've seen situations where it hasn't worked. So I think it's a mixed bag. That said, I do think litigation is a tool, and it's a tool that we should continue to use. Individuals can bring, whether they're state or federal claims against officers who have committed misconduct. So it's something that is there that we need to pursue, because I think litigation will help push reform, will help push accountability, will help push transparency. So it's something that we need to continue to do.
You said something interesting. You said that litigation will help push reform. But for the average person that may be the victim of police misconduct or excessive force, litigation also costs money. So what do you do if you constantly see, or what does a community do if it's a low-income community, if it's a marginalized community, and they see these patterns of corruption, but they just don't have the resources? Can we legitimately say to them, well, the system works, use litigation? How?
Well, I think the system has some built-in mechanisms to help tackle the problem that you're talking about. For instance, you can bring a Section 1983 claim, right? And that, I think, was mentioned by your previous guest, right? Well, what that statute contemplates is that if an individual wins a particular lawsuit that they bring, it contemplates attorney's fees, right? So you can get that. You can get that if you win. So that's contemplated. There are situations in which attorneys will accept contingency fees, meaning, after a particular case is won, they'll get a percentage of whatever the damages award amount is. So at the onset, you really don't need the funds in order to bring the lawsuit. So I think there are things that people can do that won't, at least at the outset, involve funds, right, to bring these particular types of cases.
Kind of piggybacking, kind of segueing a bit. So when you have, we're told to use the system works. But when we hear about, for example, former Bronx detective Joseph Franco, there are a number of cases, I read somewhere where over 500 cases are being dismissed because he was found to be so egregiously dishonest. From an internal perspective, or since you've represented the government before, how do you even digest something like that? Like, how do you go all the way back to where that kind of culture was born? Do you, like, how do you even begin to peel that kind of onion?
I mean, I'm not familiar with that particular case. I don't speak on that. That's a difficult question. I think if we're talking about peeling back the culture, then I think culture is about habits, right? So you need to get at those bad habits. And I think, as I mentioned, litigation is one thing that you can do. And in so doing, you can bring certain types of claims, right? So, for instance, in a federal in a federal lawsuit, you can bring what's called Monell claims, and those claims are claims that seek to get at patterns of past misconduct, of continued misconduct, of a cult. You know, they get to ingrained police cultures. So, to the extent you have a case and you have the right facts, then you can bring these type of claims that get at these types of pattern of like entrenched police behaviors. And so I think that's one way to kind of get at that bad culture.
When you did did the work with the special state law enforcement defense that focused specifically on police misconduct cases, did you run into any administrative issues, any administrative walls, or, you know, because of these rules or the lack of these rules, it was hard to come to a solution or to get resolution in a certain area? Did you come into contact with just bad policy?
Did I come into contact with bad policy? Well, let me say this. I think the mandate that I was given, while it was to litigate police cases and defend them, the mandate was primarily, or our focus was to promote justice for the citizens of New York. So what did that mean? It meant looking at a particular case, looking to defend it, but however, if the actions of the officer were not appropriate, were not justifiable, then we weren't going to back that particular case. And so to the extent there were things that weren't good, then we weren't going to back them.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. We're going to be, please make sure you come right back as we continue our interview with attorney Duane Blackman on evaluating police misconduct.
Nice going, Spencer. I can't believe we broke Old Man Hennessy's window.
Correction, dude. You broke. I just threw the ball.
This is really bad. What are we gonna do?
We? Go to the door, ask for the ball back.
Are you serious?
It's my ball, Myrtlebeck.
You're so dead. I'd run away.
Yeah, to Uruguay.
Kiss your life goodbye. Sorry.
Let's go. See ya. Remember me and your well.
Nice one. Some friends you are.
Keep smiling, keep shining.
Hi. Tell him it was an accident. And we can fix the window. Come on. I'll come with you.
Loyalty. Pass it on.
You go first.
A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's a matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Awkward. I'm the awkward silence. You try to avoid me, then there I am again.
But an awkward silence can be a great thing.
Like Kelly here is about to demonstrate.
You haven't really been yourself lately. Are you okay?
Find out how you can help a friend with their mental health
at seizetheawkward.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Thank you so much for joining us again on Inside Scoop. My name is Deborah Woolen, and our guest right now this evening is attorney Duane Blackman. And we were talking about navigating our criminal legal system in the face of police misconduct. So let's talk about accountability. There is this perception that as a citizen, if I break the law, I know that the law is my standard of behavior. If I break the law, there is an established punishment that I can expect. But there is this perception that as a law enforcement officer, there's this nebulous perspective or like this moving target of accountability. Is that the case? Has that been your experience? Or if that's not the case, you mentioned earlier that there is this expectation that an officer is to administer justice and to act justly. But is there a moving target? Like, what is the standard of behavior? What is the standard of accountability for proper law enforcement accountability?
Okay, let me just make a point here. When I talked about seeking justice, I was talking about my mandate as a government attorney representing police officers, right? It was to look at their particular actions and see whether or not their actions, given the circumstance, was justifiable. And to the extent those actions did not meet legal standards, then no, we weren't going to back those actions, right? Because they weren't correct. And that was not doing justice, for instance, when I was in New York, for the citizens of New York, right? So that was the mandate. So it wasn't win at all costs because a police officer took whatever particular action that the officer took. It wasn't that. It was, well, let's look at those actions and did they comport to the law? And if they didn't, then no, we weren't going to do that because that was justice.
Okay.
Okay. I'm sorry. I kind of missed. Okay. So I just wanted to make that point clear. And so the other part of your, if you could just repeat the other part of your question
no
was.
Problem. Is there a moving target essentially when it comes to law enforcement accountability? As I mentioned, as a citizen, there's no moving target. There's the law. And if I break the law, this is my punishment. But for example, with Amber Geiger, who murdered Bontham Jean as he was sitting in his home, and she claimed that she was going into she thought that she was going into her home and that she was shooting an intruder. And there are people that say she only got 10 years. So it kind of seems like there's this double standard. In your opinion, is that the case?
I think there should not be a double standard. I think accountability for police officers needs to be clear. And I think in their actions need to be transparent. I think if we are going to get this clear, transparent policing, I think that demands that the police, in certain respects, reimagine what policing is. I think it requires police officers policing, but also looking to help meet the demands of their particular communities. And I say that to say, we don't live in a society, right, where we don't need police officers. Right? We all want to feel safe. That said, we don't want policing that is biased or unjust towards a segment or particular segments of society. Right? We want unbiased, just policing. So the question is, well, how do we get there? And I think that involves conversations with the community and reimagining policing and what is good policing, because I think that concept has changed, right? So if we look at some of the more recent cases that we've had, if we're talking about excessive force, right? What we see is minor incidents, right, or minor crimes that end up devolving into situations that I don't think anyone in the larger community now wants. For instance, I don't know, selling loosies on the side of the street, right? And an officer goes to make an arrest, and the individual doesn't want to get arrested. and then there's an altercation and that leads to deaths, right? Or some other misdemeanor, let's say public urination. An officer comes to issue a ticket and the person doesn't want to take the ticket and it turns into a physical confrontation, and next thing there's an injury. And I think as a community, people are saying, well, really? For a misdemeanor crime, was that worth it? Do we want this? And I think what we've seen is people don't want that no more.
Right.
So I think we need to have serious discussions about how we're going to reimagine policing.
Culturally, though, within law enforcement, from your perspective, is there resistance to that? Is there resistance to having these conversations? We've heard of the blue wall of silence, whereas officers protect each other and they don't speak against another officer, good, bad, or indifferent. Have you found that there is resistance to reimagining policing?
I think, sure, among certain segments there is that. I think that often is the case when there's change, right? People don't want to change. I think change, cultural change, is difficult. It is something that takes time. It is something that needs to take aim at particular habits directly. They need to be targeted and they need to be addressed specifically. And that is going to involve retraining. So I think there needs to be investment into, for instance, retraining. And there has to be buy-in. And it's got to be buy-in from everyone. Coupled with that, I've mentioned litigation, right? So to the extent there are bad actors out there, or police officers that aren't doing the right thing and continue to do continue to do those bad things, then we need to bring lawsuits against those individuals, right? And make them liabilities so that they are no longer on the police forces, right? So we start to let's get out those bad apples, and then with the new officers, with the retraining, we're getting a different mindset, and we can begin to slowly change the culture. But that, again, is going to take time.
Indeed. So you mentioned retraining, or getting someone who, like you said, is a bad actor, getting them off of the force. What if that officer, they can no longer work perhaps in Fairfax County, but they can work in LA County? Just instances like that. Do you think there should be policies in place to prevent an officer from potentially causing harm in another jurisdiction? For sure, definitely. I think in police department hiring practices, then we need to look at that, right? So if you're applying for a new job, then you need to ask that question. Were you ever part of another police force? Were you ever disciplined? Why? And if they were, well, let's get those records and let's look closer at that police officer. And if that police officer isn't right for the job, then he shouldn't be hired, he or she. Absolutely. Just a couple of more questions. When you look at consequences of bad policing, wrongful death, wrongful convictions, or just serious injury, how do we can't give people their time back. We can't bring people back. Is that enough of these cases? Do you think that's enough to get us to the place of, as you mentioned, getting us from bad policing to good policing? Or do you think it's going to take is it impact litigation, or like when you mentioned litigation and civil cases, is it one case, 50 cases? Does it depend on the city? Does it depend on the circumstance? Like, what do you think it will really take to get us to good policing and just kind of decreasing the bad apples that we have?
Wow, that's a big question. Litigation is simply one tool, right? It's one tool that we can use, but it can't be the only thing. So we got to look to do other things, right? The previous guest that you had mentioned, civilian complaint boards, right? So that's another way to look at remedying misconduct, right? So we need to have those oversight boards, right, that can look at police departments. Protests, right? We've seen after the George Floyd incident, protests throughout the nation, right? What did that do? Well, the court of public opinion you saw start to drive certain change, right? So we have oversight, we have protests, we have litigation. I mentioned before that we need retraining, right? So with retraining. So I think there's so many things that are going to play into this that's going to help get us where we need to get. But I also want to emphasize that the change is typically very slow. So this is going to be a slow process.
In your experience representing the government, we often hear about officer to civilian misconduct. How about officer to officer? What has been your experience in that? I would assume it's probably rare, or is it?
Officer to officer misconduct in what sense? It's just unclear.
Discrimination, harassment, bullying.
Yeah, we've seen instances of that, definitely. I think police officers, that job, like other jobs, has similar problems to other areas, right? So again, there's discrimination, there's harassment. So yeah, I have seen that. Also, you mentioned, and we've talked about the culture of policing, right? So to the extent there has been police officers that wanted to speak out against a particular culture or a particular practice, then I have seen situations where those officers have faced repercussions because of that, right? So yeah, there's instances of that, yes.
Okay. One last question. Do you think that, or I'm assuming that your position is probably unique as a Black man who you specialize in this area of ensuring law enforcement accountability from a legal perspective. How has your experience affected your approach?
As a Black man?
Yes. In 10 seconds.
In 10 seconds. Well, it just, listen, I want to help better my community as a Black man. And so doing this job brings me tremendous joy, right? Because I'm helping people like me. I understand their experiences.
Thank you so much for joining us for Inside Scoop. Have a wonderful evening.